Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the director of content for RChain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of RChain, including our foundational language, Rolang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
One of the things about the RChain research efforts is that it's a little bit broader than just process calculi or types or category theory. We have research efforts tending towards hardware. We have research efforts looking at various ways to realize a consensus on a quantum protocol layer. And we also have research efforts in governance. And one of the things that I think is really interesting and important is to recognize that there are lots of governance models besides, monarchy and oligarchy and democracy that we utilize regularly in modern society. And one of those, and I'm not sure that everyone recognizes it as such, is the scientific process and the mathematical process. I distinguish the two because in science you can never prove a theory, you can only falsify a theory. Whereas in mathematics, the rules of the game are set up so that you can actually prove things. And communities respond to various utterances by, essentially validating or verifying certain kinds of assertions. And the way I think about the governance process in science and mathematics is it really is a form of behavior modification. And so when one makes an assertion to the community, it needs to be consensually validatable. People can go and check for themselves whether or not the assertion a scientist or mathematician has made is true or stands up to scrutiny. Mm-hmm. So it's open to all. So in that sense, it shares something with democracy, but it is not like democracy, at least in as much as popular opinion doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. You can have lots and lots of opinions about whether or not P equals NP, but at the end of the day, either it's going to be true or false or independent of the axioms that you're using to establish that the veracity of such a statement. There's an interesting question here. It's like, what can the blockchain community take away or learn from scientific governance and mathematical governance? So that's my opening volley. So let me just check in with you guys and see. First of all, do my statements make sense?
It generally makes sense. My first reaction is there also seems to be a difference, not just in opinion versus fact, but in whether the utterances under scrutiny pertain to the behavior of the community in question, or simply the state of their world or something. It seems like there may be some scientific results that have consequences for people's behavior, but then there are some that simply state that things are the way that they are.
That's an important and interesting observation because it touches on many things. Just one example where there's some twisted loops in this, even just to go after the validation of certain proposals requires coordination and coordination at scale. Mm-hmm. So the kind of example that I have in mind is the Large Hadron Collider. Mm-hmm. Right. So there are some proposals about the standard model in physics that needed to be verified or validated, and they couldn't be verified or validated without a considerable investment by the scientific community to go after those questions. I don't believe it's the case, but someone might argue that questions about the Higgs boson are not necessarily going to address the behavior of the community. But I think that turns out not to be true.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say something like the scientific method as a form of governance, you're just suggesting that kind of the implications from our scientific inquiry having some sort of effect on our behavior kind of collectively, right?
No, it's not
Okay.
as simple as that. It's not
Okay.
just that science informs a political process,
Mhm.
but that science is in fact itself a political process,
Mm.
and mathematics is a political process,
Mhm.
right? So in particular, if you have a physicist who regularly makes proposals which are outside the pale, in the sense that no one can validate their experiments, and the math doesn't check out, then eventually the community ceases to pay attention to this physicist's proposals. It might be entertaining, but or gather attention for another reason, but they don't gather attention from the point of view of being scientific proposals. And as such, if the community turns their attention away from a member of the community because of their behavior, that community member's behavior will typically become modified,
Mm. Okay.
right? Because
Yeah,
they're
that
actually
makes sense.
seeking to participate in the community.
Right.
So either they modify their behavior, or they don't participate in the community anymore. And as such, it's a form of governance.
I'm trying to get a feel for how the analogy works. Somebody making proposals in a field. Are there proposals like bills?
So that's a really interesting
Or
question.
what
Like,
would be an analogy?
how are they like bills? Except in scientific fields like sociology or psychology, the proposals are not normative, right? They're not of the form "we should." However, even that comes into question when you talk about how the community organizes itself to answer certain questions. Statements of the form "we should" begin to occur when the community says, we want to verify this aspect of the standard model as relates to the Higgs boson. And so we should pool together our resources in order to be able to conduct the following experiments. There's some loops in here that are complex and interesting. And I would go further. I would say that markets are really good at evaluating the opinion of a community, and in particular, opinions about relative valuation of resources and resource distributions.
Yeah.
Right? And I would argue that science and mathematics are about cultivating a working relationship to truth. And that's what those processes optimize for. And I think it's important to have both of those kinds of tools, right? If we have drifted so far in our discourse that there's no working relationship to truth, then that's dangerous for society, for all kinds of reasons, which I don't need to go into here. So we need processes that will cultivate a working relationship to truth, or to truth. But we also need to be able to ascertain opinions, because even though opinions are not the same as truth, they help us understand sentiment, and they help us understand pulse and feel and those kinds of things, which are also, they're not truth, but they're the basis, the provisional basis for action. An opinion connected to a working relationship to truth has more efficacy than either of them do on their own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's One of the really interesting things about practice of science, starting to go into research, it's interesting to see how it really happens in the community. The practice of science is not always as scientific as one might hope. I guess each individual is generally, doing their best to approach things scientifically, but the general progress of the community can sometimes be largely driven by whatever is hot at the time because somebody had a particularly powerful result. Sometimes is good enough guidance, like a powerful, similarly to like if somebody has good evidence that a certain physical experiment is potentially very important for a certain subject, and that's like proposing a bill and people vote for it by supporting those experiments. I guess similarly in math, if somebody shows, hey, I found this really cool result, and then people start building around that, there's a balance there between people exploring what they enjoy and are interested in, and then also like paying attention to the larger progress. I've been surprised that there isn't more large scale infrastructure to guide the progress of these fields, and maybe like the virtual world can help a lot with that.
That's a very interesting perspective. I mean, and my experience bears out what you're saying. I'm curious, Isaac, do you have any thoughts as relates to this?
Well, so I was just going to say that, I mean, this interplay between facts and opinions, especially in scientific or mathematical setting, I think all of us as investigators or researchers have our own opinions or beliefs about how we expect things to work. And that kind of guides our interests or our explorations to some extent. But of course, we're all subject to all of the previous results that are already known to be true. So all of these truths that we're surrounded by. But certainly, they both have their own special and important roles to play in the process.
It's also interesting because, there's such an attention deficit in the culture at large. I've recently heard figures that suggest that the number of peer-reviewed published proofs that are erroneous has jumped above 50%. One researcher suggested that it was closer to 80%.
Wait,
So
80% of published
What?
proofs are
80%
actually erroneous?
Yes, that was this researcher's claim. Now I haven't had a
That
chance to
doesn't
look
seem possible.
Yeah.
but even if you have error rates in the like because I've seen published results where it's in the 40% range,
Wow.
and even at that sort of error rate, we have a fake news problem in science and math.
Yeah. Wow, we didn't even need Facebook to interject here.
I think there's something really interesting going on here. There was this crisis that was recently reported, like over the last 3 to 5 years. People have been talking about how many results in science are not reproducible.
I heard about that. Was that mainly in like the social sciences, or
No,
was it actually throughout science?
it was throughout science. So it was
Wow.
first
I had
noticed.
heard it in like psychology.
Yeah.
Maybe it was in more.
So it was first noticed in psychology and sociology. And then people began to ask, well, what's the scope of this?
On one hand, it's very surprising, and on another hand, maybe it's not so surprising.
Call me idealistic, and it's probably true, but I see blockchain as a possible, as enabling communities to reinvent or reboot governance.
Yeah.
If we're going to take that idea seriously, then I think we have to look at all of the different governance models that are available,
Mm-hmm.
and shake up our beliefs about them. I think it's really easy to get stale and stodgy and think, okay, well, we've looked at all of these, and democracy is the worst except for all the others, and kind of um,
I think those are basically Ralph Merkel's words exactly.
So so we can kind of take that approach, but I wonder if maybe there's something fresh that comes from a governance process that is more like the scientific governance process, where
Mhm.
anyone can make a proposal, but then there are evaluation criteria and sort of consensual validation criteria that the entire community goes through rigorously. I mean, I
Mhm.
remember when I saw Kickstarter, and I thought, well, if we did this at scale, why couldn't we just get rid of whole swaths of what Congress does by just doing this
Yeah.
all online, right?
Mhm.
Why can't we have Kickstarter funding for public works? And of course, there are all kinds of problems with it. But if it were coupled with, a governance process that was more science-like or more math-like, then that might open the door for something like that. I don't know. These are just questions that have been bubbling around in my head for a long time now. I mean, I think this is also what inspired so many people about the DAO, right? The reason
Mhm.
so many people gave so much money to the DAO initially was this kind of vision, a much more egalitarian and open process to
Mhm.
allocate public funds to
Yeah.
projects where people feel like things need to get done.
Right.
Um,
It's more of a true alignment of incentives, I guess.
Being someone who is more mathematically or scientifically inclined, I want to test the idea.
Yeah.
I want to run some thought experiments at a minimum before rolling this out at scale. And I also just want to check and see, well, how good is the scientific process, right? We look around us and we say, well, obviously, in the fields of medicine and engineering and computation and physics and astronomy, there have been some pretty astonishing progress, um, in the sense of our being able to make really fine-grained predictions about how things will unfold and have those verified. And as a result, be able to formulate plans of action, whether they are therapies or construction projects um, or things like the Large Hadron Collider that come out of this common understanding that we've built up. So obviously, there's progress in a I hate to use that word, but in some sense there's measurable efficacy. There's an unreasonable effectiveness of reason, so to speak. On the other hand, there are ways in which it hasn't worked out very well. One is the error rate for science, and the other is that science and engineering and mathematics, uh, coupled to societal action at scale in this way, seems to be very much culpable when we talk about climate change, right? When you have unbridled application of science to agriculture without other values to balance things out, industrial agriculture is one of the major culprits in climate change. Another example is aviation. It's like the carbon output of flying is really a problem. It's not clear to me how the scientific process, without some other kind of tempering, is a success.
There is this absolutely quote unquote unreasonable effectiveness of reason. I don't think it's that unreasonable, but we just don't understand it yet. It hasn't been sufficiently understood, and yeah, I mean, we need to integrate science and economics and ecology and governance. They just can't operate separately now. We just have too much power now that we can't keep doing things ad hoc. we don't have an excuse anymore to be doing things as ad hoc as we are. We have more than enough conceptual and physical technology to start being responsible and formalizing all of this stuff and making it rational and at least pointed towards ethical. It's not as impossible as people think, but yeah, it's just going to take a new kind of concerted effort.
Yeah, I agree with you, and very much that, and this is kind of why I wanted to have a conversation like this, and I'd like to have a lot more of them, just across the RChain community and across the blockchain community, and ultimately, hopefully, with policymakers and other aspects of society. But I really believe that again, we have to take a fresh look at what is governance, where are the governance processes that are in operation in our lives and in our culture, and what have the results been, and be really honest and sober about when we ask those questions. I think it's not okay to get into a discussion and just say, well, science has been the be all and end all. And likewise, we can't say that markets are the be all and end all of how to tap into collective intelligence or collective wisdom. I don't think either of them work so well on their own. And I also think that they are intrinsically coupled. At the end of the day, every mathematician who is practicing, she's got to get her funding from somewhere. And usually that if you trace that funding, it generally lands in the marketplace somewhere. Even if it comes through government grants or institutional grants, if you go behind those grants and behind whatever's behind that, you land into markets. And so those kinds of things are absolutely coupled, and being aware of how they can be coupled so that we could ask whether or not they should be coupled in the way that they are, I think is really important. I think it's a part of this process of shaking up our brushing the cobwebs off of how we think about governance.
That's a huge thing that blockchain will offer, is transparency as to the interconnections of those systems. Hopefully, eventually, it's going to make all of this explicit, rather than everyone just being very hazy about how this is all working.
I mean, what we're all working towards, right, with blockchain is like increased transparency, and then also the availability of information that people have agreed is true, which is essentially, kind of goes back to this whole scientific process that we're talking about, which is essentially just a consensus mechanism, right? Like, we're agreeing that the results of these experiments are true because these independent researchers can all go do their own experiments and reproduce these results. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with kind of our information infrastructure as it stands today, is that we have so much information that we have access to, but no real discernible way to say whether or not it's good information. And that's certainly one area I would love to see improved by blockchain technology.
No, I agree 100%. Just the other day, Nora Germain was proposing a tool to disseminate information about climate. So where people could come and put reports, news or other kinds of data. For example, just report that Chennai is out of water, or report that we've had the hottest summer on record in Europe, or these kinds of things, and then have the behavior appropriately incentivized, right? So stories that turn out to be valued by the community and accurate are incentivized, and those people who curate stories to determine their veracity, whether they they verify a valued story, or they defend against a story that is false, or could be misleading, or provide misinformation. That could also be, that behavior could be incentivized. So a tool like that could be of considerable value, and could sit on top of a blockchain quite easily. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the biggest issues with people's willingness to accept the idea of climate change and humans' role in that process, because we're all so small and our views are localized, and you know, how could we possibly make this humongous impact? But it's a collective effort, you know, it's not just one person or one organization that's doing it. And so that would kind of give us more of a global perspective.
Yes, exactly. I mean, 140 characters isn't interesting, but if you make a stream, of a billion 140 character utterances, you start to get some interesting signal in there.
Yeah.
So I agreed 100%. So I think that blockchain can help with those kinds of things, and I think that's obvious. I mean, I think for those of us who are in the blockchain space, we've contemplated those kinds of tools for quite some time now. One thing, though, I think also is important to understand is that the blockchain infrastructure itself is a massive engineering undertaking. It's a massive social undertaking. It will require governance in order to get it done. And it will also require governance in order to maintain it. You know, there really is such a thing as bit rot. And that happens in part because there's volatility in hardware, and it happens in part because systems are made of multiple components, and one component may evolve at a different rate than another, and so there's a considerable maintenance effort for any blockchain infrastructure, and that will also require governance. And so there's a kind of meta circular loop here where it would be really nice to have use the blockchain to help out with the governance of the blockchain.
It's a bootstrapping effort.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. But again, because it's a technologically based offering and infrastructure, then the methods of science and engineering become particularly interesting. They're worth looking at as a form of adjudication on various proposals, right? And it makes sense. We can argue from a math, engineering, and science point of view about a particular consensus protocol, and we should, right? And that is not a democratic process. We don't vote on whether or not the Paxos algorithm works.
Mm-hmm.
We prove it, and then we test implementations of it. So far, we haven't given it a good enough shot.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, we can build the technology, but if we don't govern it properly, then what exactly are we building?
Yeah, exactly right.
What do you think of the blockchain community's thoughts on governance so far?
It's really interesting. In many ways, I think, like if I take the Ethereum community as just one example, it's really interesting because I think there's a spirit of being more egalitarian, more open, more free, and yet if you look at the actual forms that play out, Vitalik is benevolent dictator. There's a kind of say one thing out of the side of one's mouth and do another. Even within our chain, I found that there's this enormous pressure because I want to be able to listen to all these voices, but I also know that the information disseminating through the community is disseminating at really uneven and unequal rates. And so people will be making proposals which I know to be deleterious to the cooperative. And so what do I do as someone who holds a certain fiscal or fiduciary responsibility to the cooperative? So, I don't want to act like a dictator. I also know that many people are operating without the same information I'm operating with. And so, how do I balance all of that? And I think these are really important and interesting questions. I don't think that there's enough dialogue going on. I also know that it's hard to have that dialogue going on while you're feverishly building the infrastructure, right? It's just
Yeah,
it's
that's a lot.
the Bitcoin community is fascinating to watch. I think it's decidedly libertarian. They end up often getting stymied. They can't make forward progress because the balance of decision-making authority, it's not weighed out well in a particular way. So you can get certain communities holding the rest of the community hostage.
Holding them hostage, how?
Well, it's difficult to roll out certain changes to the protocol that, a wide swath of the community thinks would be good.
Yeah, like bigger blocks or something.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So these kinds of questions have oftentimes ground to a halt inside the community because there isn't a good balance of power or balance of
Yeah.
decision-making authority.
Or literally led to a bifurcation or a fork of the network.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But that one is kind of interesting because that's definitely happens in nature. Right. And that's the other thing that I constantly want to look towards is what are the governance processes that arise in nature without human cognition, without interference from Homo sapiens? What are some governance processes that seem to work at scale? Like, for example, if you look at decision-making capacity in honeybees, what does that look like? If you look at the sort of decision-making capacity inside an individual brain, what does that look like? Those kinds of things are also interesting to me, and I believe that we should carefully pay attention to those as well, because one thing nature gets right is it knows how to scale.
I mean, a huge difference between virtual governance and normal governance is that we have so much more flexibility in the virtual world to just try different structures, and these local communities are free to experiment, and if it works, then more people join it, and it opens up a much more explorative approach to governance.
Yeah, exactly. There's a sense in which we can reintroduce play. One of the things that I've learned is that the notion of play and the notion of game is essential for effective decision making and essential for good social processes. Human beings, they learn by playing from the beginning, right? Children play. The tons of studies that suggest that executives who can retain a sense of play, even in high risk situations, are far more effective. If you look at a lot of cultural shifts, right, moving from warfare to the Olympics or other kinds of games is a big win. A lot less loss of blood and a lot more possibility for achieving excellence. Even in mathematics, and one of the things I like to point out is that I'm aware of three distinct notions of games. So there's the von Neumann-Nash games. There's the Conway games, and I'm not talking about the game of life. I'm talking about his the structures. Pardon me, that he explores on numbers and games, exactly. And then there's the Highland, the Abramsky Highland on games. And each one of these different notions has led to groundbreaking results, like kicked open problems that we were stuck on for quite some time. And I think that it's no accident. I think it's because human beings and human cognition is sort of pre-organized to use a notion of game and play that we do better under those conditions. And so when you talk about the flexibility of the virtual and online setting, I think part of that is it allows us to excel at what we excel at, which is play. To use Gregory Bateson's language, the nip denotes the bite, but does not denote what the bite denotes, right? So in this playful setting, we can engage in behavior that would otherwise be too risky, and thereby learn things faster without falling off the cliff.
Does any of those notions of game accommodate for games in which it's not one entity versus an opponent, but rather just like an entity in an environment, just trying to achieve some goal within constraints?
Yeah, I mean, yes, Abramsky generalizes the Abramsky Highland On games to situations like that. So multiplayer games, not just zero sum.
Yeah.
Right? And then certainly in the von Neumann Nash games, you can contemplate games which are not zero sum as well. But I do think that those are really important games to explore when we're talking about forms of governance that are going to yield different outcomes. I think a lot of focus on zero sum kinds of activities have resulted in the situation that we're currently facing. And that's an opinion. I don't. I think it would be hard to formulate that in a way that we can prove it. But it's a gut feeling that if we look at coordinating games that are not zero sum, where you can have this kind of local global view and allow people to get a sense of participating in something larger than themselves, that has a real win.